the secret oaths, and the secret proceedings.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
Yeah, that's it. It's the 16th of July 2016. This is UCY.tv with the Solvinur event. Welcome everybody. Today we should be continuing with Brave New World. Part 5 today. In the chat room at UCY TV. If you want to join them, go to UCY and find the chat link over there. You can also go to reallibertymedia.com, and there we are, channel 6. So check them out. Welcome Cracker in the UCY chat, Damn, Defiant, and Grump44. I am Lone Frog, also there, welcome buddy. Joe Friday, hey. Juana Taco, the new and improved Surely You Jest version. Me and two Anons. What's up, everybody? And we had I had a little bit of a late nighter yesterday, following the events in Turkey. So, don't know. It's not really a topic for this show, but it sure was interesting. One of the comments from one of the Dutch political parties was like, good, let's get rid of this Islamo-fascist regime, or something to that effect. And the sooner the better, or something like that. So yeah, most of the comments made by other politicians were more of the we support democracy kind. So I got my coffee and my cigarette, ready to dive in to about where we left off, because again my browser crashed and this stupid thing won't jump back to where I was, but I think it was here. Linda and the Savage is where we were. He pressed himself against her. He put his arm round her neck. Linda cried out, "Oh, be careful, my shoulder." And she pushed him away, hard. His head banged against the wall. "Little idiot," she shouted, and then suddenly she began to slap him. "Linda," he cried out, "oh mother, don't. I'm not your mother. I won't be your mother." But Linda, she slapped him on the cheek. "Turned into a savage," she shouted, "having young ones like an animal. If it hadn't been for you, I might have gone to the inspector. I might have got away, but not with a baby. That would have been too shameful." He saw that she was going to hit him again and lifted his arm to guard his face. Oh, don't, Linda, please don't. Little beast, she pulled down his arm. His face was uncovered. Don't, Linda, his eyes shut, expecting the blow. But she didn't hit him. After a little time, he opened his eyes again and saw that she was looking at him. He tried to smile at her. Suddenly, she put his arms round him and kissed him again and again. Sometimes, for several days, Linda didn't get up at all. She lay in bed and was sad, or else drank the stuff that Popeye brought, and laughed a great deal and went to sleep. Sometimes she was sick. Often she forgot to wash him, and there was nothing to eat except cold tortillas. He remembered the first time she found those little animals in his hair, how she screamed and screamed. The happiest times were when she told him about the other place. And you really can go flying whenever you like? Whenever you like. And she would tell him about the lovely music that came out of a box, and all the nice games you could play, and the delicious things to eat and drink, and the light that came when you pressed a little thing in the wall, and the pictures that you could hear and feel and smell as well as see, and another box for making nice smells, and the pink and green and blue and silver houses as high as mountains, and everybody happy and no one ever sad or angry, and everyone belonging to everyone else, and the boxes where you could see and hear what was happening at the other side of the world, and babies in lovely clean bottles. Everything so clean, and no nasty smells, no dirt at all. And people never lonely, but living together and being so jolly and happy, like the summer dances here in Malpay, but much happier, and the happiness being there every day. He listened by the hour, and sometimes when he and the other children were tired with too much playing, one of the old men of the pueblo would talk to them in those other words of the great transformer of the world, and the long fight between the right hand and the left hand, between the wet and dry, of Avona, who made a great fog by thinking in the night, and then made the whole world out of the fog, out of Earth Mother and Sky Father, of Ahiuta and Marcel Lema, the twins of War and Chance, and of Jesus and Pokong, of Mary and Etsanalei, the woman who makes herself young again, and the black stone at Laguna, and the great eagle and Our Lady of Acoma. Strange stories, all the more wonderful to him for being told in the other words and not so fully understood. Lying in bed, he would think of heaven and London and Our Lady of Acoma, and the rows and rows of babies in clean bottles, and Jesus flying up, and Linda flying up, and the great director of the world hatcheries, and Avonavillona. Lots of men came to see Linda. The boys began to point their fingers at him. In the strange other words, they said that Linda was bad. They called her names he did not understand, but he knew were bad names. One day they sang a song about her again and again. He threw stones at them. They threw back. A sharp stone cut his cheek. The blood wouldn't stop. He was covered with blood. Linda taught him to read. With a piece of charcoal, she drew pictures on the wall, an animal sitting down, a baby inside a bottle, and then she wrote, "The cat is on the mat, the tot is in the pot." He learned quickly and easily. When he knew how to read all the words she wrote on the wall, Linda opened her big wooden box and pulled out from under those funny little red trousers she never wore, a thin little book. He had often seen it before. "When you're bigger," she said, "you can read it." Well, now he was big enough. He was proud. "I'm afraid you won't find it very exciting," she said, "but it's the only thing I have," she sighed. "If only you could see the lovely reading machines we used to have in London." He began reading. The chemical and bacteriological conditioning of the embryo. Practical instructions for beta embryo store workers. It took him a quarter of an hour to read the title alone. He threw the book on the floor. "Beastly, beastly book," he said, and began to cry. The boys still sang their horrible song about Linda. Sometimes, too, they laughed at him for being so ragged. When he tore his clothes, Linda did not know how to mend them. In the other place, she told him, people threw away clothes with holes in them and got new ones. "Rags, rags," the boys used to shout at him. "But I can read," he said to himself, "and they can't. They don't even know what reading is." It was fairly easy, if he thought hard enough about the reading, to pretend that he didn't mind when they made fun of him. He asked Linda to give him the book again. The more the boys pointed and sang, the harder he read. Soon he could read all the words quite well, even the longest. But what did they mean? He asked Linda, but even when she couldn't, even when she could answer it, didn't seem to make it very clear, and generally she couldn't answer at all. "What are chemicals?" he would ask. "Oh, stuff like magnesium salts and alcohol for keeping deltas and epsilons small and backward, and calcium carbonate for bones, and all that sort of thing." "But how do you make chemicals, Linda? Where do they come from?" "Well, I don't know. You get them out of bottles, and when the bottles are empty, you send up to the chemical store for more. It's the chemical store people who make them, I suppose, or else they send to the factory for them. I don't know. I never did any chemistry. My job was always with the embryos." It was the same with everything else he asked about. Linda never seemed to know. The old man in the pueblo had much more definite answers. The seed of man and all creatures, the seed of the sun and the seed of the earth and the seed of the sky. Havona Vilona made them all out of the fog of increase. Now the world has 4 wombs, and he laid the seeds in the lowest of the 4 wombs, and gradually the seed began to grow. One day, John calculated later that it must have been soon after his 12th birthday, he came home and found a book that he had never seen before lying on the floor in the bedroom. It was a thick book and very old. The binding had been eaten by mice. Some of its pages were loose and crumpled. He picked it up, looked at the title page. The book was called The Complete Works of William Shakespeare. Linda was lying on the bed, slipping that horrible stinking mescal out of a cup. Pope brought it, she said. Her voice was thick and hoarse like somebody else's voice. It was lying in one of the chests of the Antelope Kiva. It's supposed to have been there for hundreds of years. I expect it's true because I looked at it and it seemed to be full of nonsense. Uncivilized. Still, it'll be good enough for you to practice your reading on. She took a last sip, set the cup down on the floor beside the bed, turned over on her side, hiccuped once or twice and went to sleep. He opened the book at random. Nigh but to live, in the rank suite of an enseamed bed, stewed in corruption, honeying and make love, over the nasty sty. The strange words rolled through his mind, rumbled, like talking thunder, like the drums at the summer dances. If the drums could have spoken, like the men singing the corn song, beautiful, beautiful, so that you cried, like a old Mitsima saying magic over his feathers and his carved sticks and his bits of bone and stone Kiathla, Tsilu, Siloque, Siloque, Siloque. Kia, Silu, Silu, chisel, but better than Mitsima's magic, because it meant more, because it talked to him, talked wonderfully and only half understandably. A terrible, beautiful magic about Linda lying there snoring, with the empty cup on the floor beside the bed. About Linda and Pope. He hated Pope more and more. A man can smile and be a villain. Remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless, villain. But what did the words exactly mean? He only half knew, but their magic was strong and went on rumbling in his head. And somehow it was as though he had never really hated Pope before, never really hated him, because he had never been able to say how much he hated him. But now he has these words like drums and singing and magic, these words and the strange, strange story out of which they were taken. He couldn't make head or tail of it, but it was wonderful, wonderful all the same. They gave him a reason for hating Pope, or Popey, and they made his hatred more real, then even made Popey himself real. One day, when he came in from playing, the door of the inner room was open, and he saw them lying together on the bed, asleep, while Linda and Pope almost black beside her. That's white Linda, and Pope almost black beside her, with one arm under her shoulders and the other dark hand on her breast, and one on the plaits of his long hair lying across her throat, like a black snake trying to strangle her. Pope's gourd and a cup were standing on the floor near the bed. Linda was snoring. Blah, blah. His heart seemed to have disappeared and left the hole. He was empty and cold and rather sick and giddy. He leaned against the wall to steady himself. Remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, like drums, like the men singing for the corn, like magic. The words repeated and repeated themselves in his head. From being cold he was suddenly hot. His cheeks burned with the rush of blood. The room swam and darkened before his eyes. He ground his teeth. I'll kill him, he kept saying. And suddenly there were more words. When he is drunk asleep, or in his rage, or in the incestuous pleasure of his bed. The magic was on his side. The magic explained and gave orders. He stepped back in the outer room. When he is drunk asleep. The knife for the meat was lying on the floor near the fireplace. He picked it up and tiptoed to the door again. When he is drunk asleep. He ran across the room and stabbed. Oh, the blood! Stabbed again. As Popey heaved out of his sleep, lifted his hand to stab once more, but found his wrist caught, held, and twisted. He couldn't move. He was trapped. And there were Popey's small black eyes, very close, staring into his own. He looked away. There were 2 cuts on Popey's left shoulder. Oh, look at the blood, Linda was crying. Look at the blood. She had never been able to bear the sight of blood. Popey lifted his other hand to strike him, he thought. He stiffened to receive the blow, but the hand only took him under the chin and turned his face, so that he had to look again into Pepe's eye. For a long time, for hours and hours, and suddenly, he couldn't help it, he began to cry. Popey burst out laughing. Go, he said, in the other Indian words. Go, my brave Ayuta. He ran out into the other room to hide his tears. You are 15, said old Mitsima in the Indian words. Now I may teach you to work the clay. Squatting by the river, they worked together. First of all, said Mitsima, taking a lump of the wetted clay between his hands, we make a little moon. The old man squeezed the lump into a disk, then bent up the edges. The moon became a shallow cup. Slowly and unskillfully he imitated the old man's delicate gestures. Hold on, guys. A moon, a cup, a snow, and now a snake. Mitsima rolled out another piece of clay into a long flexible cylinder, trooped it into a circle and pressed it on to the rim of the cup. Then another snake and another. Round by round, Mitsima built up the sides of the pot. It was narrow, it bulged, it narrowed again toward the neck. Mitsima squeezed and patted, stroked and scraped, and there at last it stood, in shape of the familiar water pot of Malpay, but creamy white instead of black, and still soft to the touch. The crooked parody of Mitsima's. His own stood beside it. Looking at the 2 pots, he had to laugh. But the next one will be better, he said, and began to moisten another piece of clay. To fashion, to give form, to feel his finger gaining in skill and power, this gave him an extraordinary pleasure. A, B, C, vitamin D, he sang to himself as he worked. The fat's in the liver, the cod's in the sea. And Mitsima also sang a song about killing a bear. They worked all day, and all day he was filled with an intense, absorbing happiness. Next winter, said old Mitsima, I will teach you to make the bow. He stood for a long time outside the house, and at last the ceremonies within were finished. The door opened. They came out. Kothlu came first, his right hand outstretched and tightly closed, as though over some precious jewel. Her clenched hand similarly outstretched. Kiakemei followed. They walked in silence, and in silence behind them came the brothers and sisters and cousins and all the troop of old people. They walked out of the pueblo across the mesa. At the edge of the clid they halted, facing the early morning sun. That's probably cliff. Kothlu opened his hand. A pinch of corn meal lay white on the palm. He breathed on it, murmured a few words, then threw it, a handful of white dust, towards the sun. Kiakemi did the same. Then Kiakemi's father stepped forward and holding up a feathered prayer stick made a long prayer, then threw the stick after the cornmeal. It is finished, said old Mitsima in a loud voice. They are married. Well, said Linda as she turned away, all I can say is, it does seem a lot of fuss to make about so little. In civilized countries, when a boy wants to have a girl, he just... But where are you going, John? He paid no attention to her calling, but ran on, away, anywhere to be by himself. It is finished, old Mitsima's words repeated themselves in his mind. Finished. In silence, and from a long way off, but violently, desperately, hopelessly, he had loved Kiakime, and now it was finished. He was 16. At the full moon, in the antelope kiva, secrets would be told, secrets would be done and born. They would go down, boys, into the kiva and come out again, men. The boys were all afraid, and at the same time impatient, and at last it was the day. The sun went down, the moon rose. He went with the others. Men were standing, dark, at the entrance to the kiva. The ladder went down into the red-lighted depths. Already the leading boys had begun to climb down. Suddenly one of the men stepped forward, caught him by the arm, and pulled him out of the ranks. He broke free and dodged back into place among the others. This time the man struck him, pulled his hair. Not for you, white hair, not for the son of a she-dog, said one of the other men. The boys laughed. Go! And as he still hovered on the fringes of the group, go! The men shouted again. One of them bent down, took a stone, threw it. Go! Go! There was a shower of stones. Bleeding, he ran away into the darkness. From the red-lit kiva came the noise of singing. The last of the boys had climbed down the ladder. He was alone. All alone, outside the pueblo, on the bare plain of the mesa. The rock was like bleached bones in the moonlight. Down in the valley, the coyotes were howling at the moon. The bruises hurt him. The cuts were still bleeding, but it was not for pain that he sobbed. It was because he was all alone, because he had been driven out, alone, into this skeleton world of rocks and moonlight. At the edge of the precipice he sat down. The moon was behind him. He looked down into the black shadow of the mesa, into the black shadow of death. He had only to take one step, one little jump. He held out his right hand in the moonlight. From the cut on his wrist the blood was still oozing. Every few seconds a drop fell, dark, almost colorless in the dead light. Drop, drop. Tomorrow and tomorrow. He had discovered tyranny and death and God. Alone, always alone, the young man was saying. The words awoke a plaintive echo in Bernard's mind. Alone. So am I, he said, on a gush of confidingness. Terribly alone. Are you? John looked surprised. I thought that in the other place, Linda always said that nobody was ever alone there. Bernard blushed uncomfortably. And you see, he said, mumbling and with averted eyes, I'm rather different from most people, I suppose, if one happens to be decanted different. Yes, that's just it, the young man nodded. If one's different, one's bound to be lonely. They're beastly to one. Do you know they shut me out of absolutely everything? When the other boys were sent out to spend the night on the mountains, you know, when you have to dream which your sacred animal is, they wouldn't let me go with the others. They wouldn't tell me any of the secrets. I did it by myself, though, he added. Didn't eat anything for 5 days, then went out one night alone into those mountains there, he pointed. Patronizingly, Bernard smiled. And did you dream of anything? He asked. The other nodded. But I mustn't tell you what. He was silent for a little, then, in a low voice, Once, he went on, I did something that none of the others did. I stood against a rock in the middle of the day, in summer, with my arms out, like Jesus on the cross. What on earth for? I wanted to know what it was like being crucified, hanging there in the sun. But why? Why? Well, he hesitated, because I felt I ought to, if Jesus could stand it, and then, if one has done something wrong. Besides, I was unhappy. That was another reason. It seems a funny way of curing your unhappiness, said Bernard. But on second thought he decided that there was, after all, some sense in it. Better than taking soma. I fainted after a time, said the young man, fell down on my face. Do you see the mark where I cut myself? He lifted the thick yellow hair from his forehead. The scar showed, pale and puckered, on his right temple. Bernard looked, and then quickly, with a little shudder, averted his eyes. His conditioning had made him not so much pitiful as profoundly squeamish. The mere suggestion of illness or wounds was to him not only horrifying, but even repulsive and rather disgusting. Like dirt or deformity or old age. Hastily he changed the subject. I wonder if you'd like to come back to London with us, he asked, making the first move in a campaign whose strategy he had been secretly elaborating ever since, in the little house, he had, that's supposed to say, realized, who the father of this young savage must be. Would you like that? The young man's face lit up. Do you really mean it? Of course, if I can get permission, that is. Linda too? Well, he hesitated doubtfully. That revolting creature? No, it was impossible. Unless... It suddenly occurred to Bernard that her very revoltingness might prove an enormous asset. But of course, he cried, making up for his first hesitation with an access of noisy cordiality. The young man drew a deep breath. To think it should be coming true, what I've dreamt all my life. Do you remember what Miranda says? Who is Miranda? But the young man had evidently not heard the question. Oh wonder, he was saying, and his eyes shone, his face was brightly flushed. How many goodly creatures are there here? How beauteous mankind is! The flush suddenly deepened. He was thinking of Lenina, of an angel in bottle, green viscose, lustrous with youth and skin food, plump, benevolently smiling. His face faltered. "Oh, brave new world," he began, then suddenly interrupted himself. The blood had left his cheeks. He was as pale as paper. "Are you married to her?" he asked. "Am I what?" "Married, you know, forever. They say forever in Indian words. It can't be broken." Ford, no, Bernard couldn't help laughing. John also laughed, but for another reason, laughed for pure joy. "Oh, brave new world," he repeated. "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. Let's start at once." "You have a most peculiar way of talking sometimes," said Bernard, staring at the young man in perplexed astonishment. "And, anyhow, hadn't you better wait till you actually see the new world?" And that's the end of chapter 8. Nine. Lenina felt herself entitled, after this day of queerness and horror, to a complete and absolute holiday. As soon as they got back to the rest house, she swallowed 6 half-gram tablets of soma, lay down on her bed, and within 10 minutes had embarked for lunar eternity. It would be 18 hours at the least before she was in time again. Bernard, meanwhile, lay pensive and wide-eyed in the dark. It was long after midnight before he fell asleep. Long after midnight, but his insomnia had not been fruitless. He had a plan. Punctually on the following morning at 10 o'clock, the green-uniformed octoroon stepped out of his helicopter. Hemmard was waiting for him among the agaves. "Miss Crown's gone on Soma holiday," he explained. "Can hardly be back before 5, which leaves us 7 hours. He could fly to Santa Fe, do all the business he had to do, and be in Malpais again long before she woke up." "She'll be quite safe here by herself?" "Safe as helicopters," said Octoroon. The Octoroon assured him. They climbed into the machine and started off at once. At 10:34, they landed on the roof of the Santa Fe post office. At 10:37, Bernard had got through to the World's Controller's office in Whitehall. At 10:37, he was speaking to his Fortship's fourth personal secretary. At 10:44, he was repeating his story to the first secretary, and at 10:47 and a half, it was the deep, resonant voice of Mustafa Mond himself that sounded in his ears. "I venture to think," stammered Bernard, "that your Fortship might find the matter of sufficient scientific interest." "Yes, I do find it of sufficient scientific interest," said the deep voice. "Bring these two individuals back to London with you." "Your Fortship is aware that I shall need a special permit." "The necessary orders," said Mustafa Mond, "are being sent to the warden of the reservation at this moment. You will proceed at once to the warden's office. Good mornings, Mr. Marks." Blah, blah. There was silence. Bernard hung up the receiver and hurried up to the roof. "Warden's office," he said to the gamma-green octoroon. At 10:54, Bernard was shaking hands with the warden. "Delighted, Mr. Marks, delighted." His boom was deferential. "We have just received special orders." "I know," said Bernard, interrupting him. "I was talking to his Fortship on the phone a moment ago." His bored tone implied that he was in the habit of talking to his Fortship every day of the week. He dropped into a chair. If you'll kindly take all the necessary steps as soon as possible." "As soon as possible," he emphatically repeated. He was thoroughly enjoying himself. At 11:03, he had all the necessary papers in his pocket. So long, how do you tonate that? "Bye," he said patronizingly to the warden, who had accompanied him as far as the lift gates. "So long." He walked across to the hotel, had a bath, a vibrovac massage, and an electrolytic shave, listened in to the morning's news, looked in for half an hour on the televisor, ate a leisured luncheon, and 2:30 flew back with the octoroon to Malpais. The young man stood outside the rest house. "Bernard," he called, "Bernard." There was no answer. Noiseless, on his deerskin moccasins, he ran up the steps and tried the door. The door was locked. They were gone. It was the most terrible thing that had ever happened to him. She had asked him to come and see them, and now they were gone. He sat down on the steps and cried. Half an hour later, it occurred to him to look through the window. The first thing he saw was a green suitcase, with the initials LC painted on the lid. Joy flared up like a fire within him. He picked up a stone. The smashed glass tinkled on the floor. A moment later he was inside the room. He opened the green suitcase, and all at once he was breathing Lenina's perfume, filling his lungs with her essential being. His heart beat wildly. For a moment he was almost faint. Then, bending over the precious box, he touched, he lifted into the light, he examined. The zippers on Lenina's spare pairs of viscose velveteen shorts were at first a puzzle, then solved, a delight. Zip and then zip. He was enchanted. Her green slippers were the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He unfolded a pair of zipakamikniks, blushed, put them hastily away again. He kissed a perfumed acetate handkerchief and wound a scarf round his neck. Opening a box, he split a cloud of scented powder. His hands were flowery with the stuff. He wiped them on his chest, on his shoulders, on his bare arms. Delicious perfume. He shut his eyes. He rubbed his cheek against his own powdered arm. Touch of smooth skin against his face. Scent in his nostrils of musky dust, her real pleasant presence. Lenina, he whispered. Let's try this one. Hoppla. A noise made him start, made him guiltily turn. He crammed up his thieveries into the suitcase and shut the lid, then listened again, looked. Not a sound, not a sign of life, not a sound. And yet he had certainly heard something, something like a sigh, something like the creak of a board. He tiptoed to the door, cautiously opening it, found himself looking on to a broad landing. On the opposite side of the landing was another door, ajar. He stepped out, pushed, peeped. There, on a low bed, the sheet flung black, dressed in a pair of pink one-piece zippy jamas, lay Lenina, fast asleep and so beautiful in the midst of her curls, so touchingly childish with her pink toes and her grave sleeping face, so trustful in the helplessness of her limp hands and melted limbs, that the tears came to his eyes. With an infinity of quite unnecessary precautions, for nothing short of a pistol shot could have called Lenina back from her Soma holiday before the appointed time. He entered the room. He knelt on the floor beside the bed. He gazed, he clasped his hands, his lips moved. Her eyes, he murmured. Her eyes, her hair, her cheek, her gait, her voice. Handless in thy discourse, oh, that her hand, in whose comparison all whites are ink, writing their own reproach, to whose soft seizure the signet's down is harsh. A fly buzzed round her. He waved it away. Flies, he remembered. On the white wonder of dear Juliet's hand may seize and steal immortal blessings from her lips, who, even in pure and vestal modesty, still blush as thinking their own kisses sin. Very slowly, with the hesitant gesture of one who reaches forward to stroke a shy and possibly rather dangerous bird, he put out his hand. It hung there trembling, within an inch of those limp fingers, on the verge of contact. Did he dare to profane with his unworthiest hand that? No, he didn't. The bird was too dangerous. His hand dropped back. How beautiful she was! Then suddenly he found himself reflecting that he had only to take hold of the zipper at her neck and give one long strong pull. He shut his eyes. He shook his head with the gesture of a dog shaking its ears as it emerges from the water. Detestable thought, he was ashamed of himself, pure and vestal modesty. There was a humming in the air, another fly trying to steal immortal blessings, a wasp. A wasp? He looked, saw nothing. The humming grew louder and louder, localized itself as being outside the shuttered windows. The plane! In a panic he scrambled to his feet and ran into the other room, vaulted through the open window, and hurrying along the path between the tall agaves, was in time to receive burnt marks as he climbed out of the helicopter. That was a short chapter. We are now at 10. The hands of all the 4,000 electric clocks in all the Bloomsbury centers, 4,000 rooms, marked 27 minutes past 2. This hive of industry, as the director was fond of calling it, was in the full buzz of work. Everyone was busy, everything in ordered motion. Under the microscopes, their long tails furiously lashing, spermatozoa were burrowing headfirst into the eggs, and, fertilized, the eggs were expanding, dividing, or if Bokanovskified, budding, and breaking up into whole populations of separate embryos. From the social predestination room, the escalators were rumbling down into the basement, and there, in the crimson darkness, stewingly warm, on their cushion of peritoneum, and gorged with blood surrogate and hormones, the fetuses grew and grew, or, poisoned, languished into a stunted epsilonhood. With a faint hum and rattle, the moving racks crawled imperceptibly through the weeks and the recapitulated aeons to where, in the decanting room, the newly unbottled babes uttered their first yell of horror and amazement. The dynamos purred in the sub-basement. The lifts rushed up and down. On all the 11 floors of nurseries it was feeding time. From 1,800 bottles, 1,800 carefully labeled infants were simultaneously sucking down their pint of pasteurized external secretion. Above them, in 10 successive layers of dormitory, the little boys and girls who were still young enough to need an afternoon sleep were as busy as everyone else, though they did not know it, listening unconsciously to hypnopedic lessons in hygiene and sociability, in class consciousness and the toddler's love life. Above these signs were the playrooms, where, the weather having turned to rain, 900 older children were amusing themselves with bricks and clay modeling, Hunt the Zipper, and erotic play. Buzz, buzz, the hive was humming, busily, joyfully. Blithe was the singing of the young girls over their test tubes. The predestinator whistled as they worked, and in the decanting room, what glorious jokes were cracked above the empty bottles. But the director's face, as he entered the fertilizing room with Henry Foster, was grave, wooden with severity. A public example, he was saying. In this room, because it contains more high-caste workers than any other in the center. I have told him to meet me here at 2:30. He does his work very well, put in Henry with hypocritical generosity. I know, but that's all the more reason for severity. His intellectual eminence carries with it corresponding moral responsibilities. The greater a man's talent, the greater his power to lead astray. It is better that one should suffer than that many should be corrupted. Consider the matter dispassionately, Mr. Foster, and you will see that no offense is so heinous as unorthodoxy of behavior. Murder kills only the individual, and, after all, what is an individual? With a sweeping gesture he indicated the rows of microscopes, the test tubes, the incubators. We can make a new one with the greatest ease, as many as we like. Unorthodoxy threatens more than the life of a mere individual. It strikes at society itself. Yes, at society itself, he repeated. Ah, but here he comes. Bernard had entered the room and was advancing between the rows of fertilizers towards them. A veneer of jaunty self-confidence thinly concealed his nervousness. The voice in which he said, "Good morning, Director," was absurdly too loud. That in which, correcting his mistake, he said, "You asked me to come and speak to you here," ridiculously soft, a squeak. "Yes, Mr. Marx," said the director portentously. "I did ask you to come to me here. You returned from your holiday last night, I understand?" "Yes," Bernard answered. "Yes," repeated the director, lingering, a serpent on the S. Then, suddenly raising his voice, "Ladies and gentlemen," he trumpeted, "ladies and gentlemen." The singing of the girls over their test tubes, the preoccupied whistling of the microscopists suddenly ceased. There was a profound silence. Everyone looked round. "Ladies and gentlemen," the director repeated once more, "excuse me for thus interrupting your labors. A painful duty constrains me. The security and stability of society are in danger. Yes, in danger, ladies and gentlemen. This man," he pointed accusingly at Bernard, "this man who stands before you here, this Alpha Plus, to whom so much has been given, and from whom, in consequence, so much must be expected, this colleague of yours, or should I anticipate and say this ex-colleague, has grossly betrayed the trust imposed in him by his heretical views on sport and soma, by the scandalous unorthodoxy of his sex life, by his refusal to obey the teachings of our Ford on behalf and behave out of office hours. Even as a little infant," here the director made the sign of the T, "he has proved himself an enemy of society, a subverter, ladies and gentlemen, of all order and stability, a conspirator against civilization itself. For this reason I propose to dismiss him with ignominy from the post he has held in this center. I propose forthwith to apply his transference to a sub-center of the lowest order, and that his punishment may serve the best interest of society." as far as possible removed from any important center of population. In Iceland, he will have small opportunity to lead others astray by his unforwardly example. The director paused. Then, folding his arms, he turned impressively to Bernard. "Marx," he said, "can you show any reason why I should not now execute the judgment passed upon you?" "Yes, I can," Bernard answered in a very loud voice. Somewhat taken aback, but still majestically. "Then show it," said the director. "Certainly, but it's in the passage. One moment." Bernard hurried to the door and threw it open. "Come in," he commanded, and the reason came in and showed itself. There was a gasp, a murmur of astonishment and horror. A young girl screamed. Standing on a chair to get a better view, someone upset the test tube full of spermatozoa, bloated, sagging, and among those young, youthful bodies, those undistorted faces, a strange and terrifying monster of middle-agedness, Linda advanced into the room. Coquettishly smiling, her broken and discolored smile as rolling as she walked, with what was meant to be a voluptuous undulation, her enormous haunches. Bernard walked beside her. "There he is," he said, pointing at the director. "Do you think I didn't recognize him?" Linda asked indignantly. Then, turning to the director, "Of course I knew you, Tomakin. I should have known you anywhere among 1,000, but perhaps you've forgotten me. Don't you remember? Don't you remember, Tomakin? You're Linda." She stood looking at him, her head on one side, still smiling, but with a smile that became progressively, in the face of the director's expression of petrified disgust, less and less self-confident. That wavered and finally went out. "Don't you remember, Tomakin?" she repeated in a voice that trembled. Her eyes were anxious, agonized. The blotched and sagging face twisted grotesquely into the grimace of extreme grief. "Tomakin," she held out her arms. One began to titter. "What's the meaning," began the director, "of this monstrous—" "Tomakin!" She ran forward, her blanket trailing behind her, threw her arms round his neck, hid her face on his chest. A howl of laughter went up irrepressibly. "This monstrous practical joke," the director shouted. Red in the face, he tried to disengage himself from her embrace. Desperately she clung. "But I'm Linda!" The laughter drowned her voice. "You made me have a baby!" She screamed above the uproar. There was a sudden and appalling hush. Eyes floated uncomfortably, not knowing where to look. The director went suddenly pale, stopped struggling, and stood, his hands on her wrists, staring down at her, horrified. "Yes, a baby, and I was its mother!" She flung the obscenity like a challenge into the outraged silence. Then, suddenly, breaking away from him, ashamed, covered her face with her hands, sobbing. "It wasn't my fault, Tomakin, because I always did my drill, didn't I? Always. I don't know how. If you knew how awful, Tomakin. But he was a comfort to me all the same." Turning towards the door, "John," she called. "John." Alright, hold on here a sec, guys. blah, blah. So, yeah, I think I can do that, even though it's going to take a little bit of a detour. This is UCY.tv, guys. And if you've been listening the past hour and 5 minutes, you've noticed that there wasn't any advertising, right? So go to UCY.tv. I don't even know. Let me see if there is one. Blah blah. I'm gonna have to stop this player from starting, but it's already paused. Let's see. Scrolling down. No, yes. If you scroll down at ucy.tv, all the way at the bottom, there's a little donate button. So check that out. Because you don't hear you don't hear advertising. Normally, anyways. There's no income from advertising. The advertising that you do here is from, for instance, William Roberts, the archives, and yeah, there's some advertising in that. But live shows like this, there's no advertising at all. Thanks to Jules. So, go to UCY, scroll down to the bottom and donate what you can. Now, let's see. Blah blah. Trying to find something. If this is possible. Nope. Delete it. Ay. Let's see. This one should work. I'm not quite sure if you guys are getting the sound now. And I'm not hearing it myself. Ha 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 ha. No, this is not it. Let's see. I'm sorry about this, guys. I should have prepared this a little better. But, let me try and find something to play. Come on. Morning, Matty and Joe. Music. Blah blah blah. YouTube. That's how I used to do it, right? Strange. YouTube. Music, video, let's see. We'll do this one. And like I said, I don't even know if you can hear this. Probably not. I can actually see if it works. Blah blah, this one. Tools, options. Audio settings. No, it's not going out. Damn it. Damn it, damn it. I'm gonna have to fix something here. Ah, blah, blah. I hope this works, guys.
Eight positions to do to America what happened to Russia, and I'm trying everything in my power and our fans' power to make sure that doesn't happen. So that was me. Nice. We are Poker Face. We thank you for being participants of Freedom Palooza 2012. We're gonna kick you off with a little warm-up song for the Illuminati. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.
Poker Face! We doen one more.
This is a public service announcement. Your country is being sold out right from under you, and your government is doing everything to make that possible. You are nothing but sons of a global plantation. What are you going to do about it? We're going to continue being a slave. We're going to wake the F see what I swallow. Yeah, but not to hear. I see what you swallow. And you follow.
Thank you, Pokerface. Check them out at pokerface.com. Welcome back, everybody. This is UCY.tv with the Solvinur event. I'm your host, Walter, from the Netherlands, hence my accent. I'm not going to ever be able to lose that, so I won't even try. Check out the website ucy.tv and also available at Real Liberty Media, channel 6. What's up, everybody? How you doing? I hope you're all okay. So let's continue where we left off. Where Linda was calling John. He came in once, paused for a moment just inside the door, looked round, then, soft on his moccasined feet, strode quickly across the room, fell on his knees in front of the director, and said in a clear voice, "My father." The word for father was not so much obscene as, with its connotation of something at one remove from the loathsomeness and moral obliquity of childbearing, merely gross, eschatological, whatever that is, rather than a pornographic impropriety. The comically smutty word relieved what had become a quite intolerable tension. Laughter broke out. Enormous, almost historical, peal after peal, as though it would never stop. My father, and it was the director. My father, oh Ford, this was really too good. The whooping and the roaring renewed themselves. Faces seemed on the point of disintegration. Tears were streaming. 6 more test tubes of spermatozoa were upset. My father! Pale, wild-eyed, the director glared about him in agony of bewildered humiliation. My father, the laughter, which had shown signs of dying away, broke out again more loudly than ever. He put his hands over his ears and rushed out of the room. And that ends chapter 10. Moving on to chapter 11. After the scene in the fertilizing room, all upper-caste London was wild to see the delicious creature who had fallen on his knees before the director of hatcheries and conditioning, or rather the ex-director, for the poor man had resigned immediately afterwards and never set foot inside the center again. Had flopped down and called him, the joke was almost too good to be true, my father. Linda, on the contrary, cut no ice. Nobody had the smallest desire to see Linda. To say one was a mother, that was past a joke. It was an obscenity. Moreover, she wasn't a real savage. He had been hatched, had been hatched out of a bottle and conditioned like anyone else. So couldn't have really quaint ideas. Yeah. That's a nice one, right? Couldn't have really quaint ideas. Finally, and this was by far the strongest reason for people's not wanting to see poor Linda, there was her appearance. Fat, having lost her youth, with bad teeth and a blotched complexion. And that figure, Ford, you simply couldn't look at her without feeling sick. Yes, positively sick. So the best people were quite determined not to see Linda, and Linda, for her part, had no desire to see them. The return to civilization was for her the return to Soma, was the possibility of lying in bed and taking holiday after holiday without ever having to come back to a headache or fit of vomiting, without ever being made to feel as you always felt after Peyote, as though you'd done something so shamefully antisocial that you could never hold up your head again. Soma played none of these unpleasant tricks. The holiday it gave was perfect, and in the morning after was disagreeable, if the morning after was disagreeable, it was so, not intrinsically, but only by comparison with the joys of the holiday. The remedy was to make the holiday continuous. Greedily she clamored for ever larger and more frequent doses. Dr. Shaw, at first demurred, then let her have what she wanted, She took as many as 20 grams a day, which will finish her off in a month or two, the doctor confided to Bernard. One day the respiratory center will be paralyzed, no more breathing, finished. And a good thing too. If we could rejuvenate, of course, it would be different, but we can't. Surprisingly, as everyone thought, for on summer holiday Linda was most conveniently out of the way, John raised objections. But aren't you shortening her life by giving her so much? In one sense, yes, Dr. Shaw admitted, but in another we're actually lengthening it. The young man stared, uncomprehending. Soma may make you lose a few years in time, the doctor went on, but think of the enormous, immeasurable durations it can give you out of time. Every summer holiday is a bit of what our ancestors used to call eternity. John began to understand. Eternity was in our lips and eyes, he murmured. Nothing. Of course, Dr. Shaw went on, you can't allow people to go popping off into eternity if they've got any serious work to do. But as she hasn't got any serious work... All the same, John persisted, I don't believe it's right. The doctor shrugged his shoulders. Well, of course, if you prefer to have her screaming mad all the time... In the end, John was forced to give in. Linda got her soma. Thenceforward, she remained in her little room on the 37th floor of Bernard's apartment house, in bed, with the radio and television always on, and the patchouli tap just dripping, and the soma tablets within reach of her hand. There she remained, and yet wasn't there at all, was all the time away, infinitely far away, on holiday. On holiday in some other world, where the music of the radio was a labyrinth of sonorous colors, a sliding, palpitating labyrinth that led, by what beautifully inevitable windings, to a bright center of absolute conviction, where the dancing images of the television box were the performers in some indescribably delicious, all singing feelie, where the dripping patchouli was more than scent, was the sun, was a million saxophones, was Popey making love, only much more so, incomparably more, and without end. No, we can't rejuvenate. But I'm very glad, Dr. Shaw had concluded, to have had this opportunity to see an example of senility in a human being. Thank you so much for calling me in. He shook Bernard warmly by the hand. It was John, then, they were all after. And as it was only through Bernard, his accredited guardian, that John could be seen, Bernard now found himself, for the first time in his life, treated not merely normally, but as a person of outstanding importance. There was no more talk of the alcohol in his blood surrogate, no gibbous at his personal appearance. Henry Foster went out of his way to be friendly. Benito Hoover made him a present of 6 packets of sex-hormone chewing gum. The assistant predestinator came out and caged almost abjectly for an invitation to one of Bernard's evening parties. As for women, Bernard had only to hint at the possibility of an invitation, and he could have whichever of them he liked. Bernard asked to meet the savage next. Bernard's asked me to meet the savage next Wednesday. Fanny announced triumphantly. It's not Bernard's. This is like a comma S, right? It's not from his, but has asked. Gee. I'm so glad, said Lenina. And now you must admit that you were wrong about Bernard. Don't you think he's really rather sweet? Fanny nodded. And I must say, she said, I was quite agreeably surprised. The chief butler, the director of predestination, 3 deputy assistant fertilizer generals, the professor of Phillies in the College of Emotional Engineering, the dean of Westminster Community Singery, the supervisor of Volcanification. The list of Bernard's notabilities was interminable. And I had 6 girls last week, he confided to Helmholtz Watson. 1 on Monday, 2 on Tuesday, 2 more on Friday, and 1 on Saturday. And if I'd had time or the inclination, there were at least a dozen more who were only too anxious. Helmholtz listened to his boastings in a silence so gloomily disapproving that Bernard was offended. You're envious, he said. Helmholtz shook his head. I'm rather sad, that's all, he answered. Bernard went off in a huff. Never, he told himself, never would he speak to Helmholtz again. The days passed. Success went fizzily to Bernard's head, and in the process completely reconciled him, as any good intoxicant should do, to a world which, up till then, he had found very unsatisfactory. Insofar as it recognized him as important, the order of things was good, but, reconciled by his success, he yet refused to forego the privilege of criticizing this order, for the act of criticizing heightened his sense of importance, made him feel larger. Moreover, he did genuinely believe that there were things to criticize. At the same time, he genuinely liked being a success and having all the girls he wanted. Before those who now, for the sake of the savage, paid their court to him, Bernard would parade a carping unorthodoxy. He was politely listened to. But, behind his back, people shook their heads. That young man will come to a bad end, they said, prophesying the more confidently in that they themselves would in due course personally see to it that the end was bad. He won't find another savage to help out a second time, they said. Meanwhile, however, there was the first savage. They were polite. And because they were polite, Bernard felt positively gigantic, and at the same time light with elation, lighter than air. Lighter than air, said Bernard, pointing upwards. Like a pearl in the sky, high above them, the weather department's captive balloons shone rosily in the sunshine. The said savage, so ran Bernard's instructions, to be shown civilized life in all its aspects. He was being shown a bird's-eye view of it at present, a bird's-eye view from the platform of the jarring T-tower. The station master and the resident meteorologist were acting as guides, but it was Bernard who did most of the talking. intoxicated, he was behaving as though, at the very least, he were a visiting world controller, lighter than air. The Bombay green rocket dropped out of the sky. The passengers alighted. 8 identical Dravidian twins in khaki looked out of the 8 portholes of the cabin, the stewards. 1,250 kilometers an hour, said the station master impressively. What do you think of that, Mr. Savage? John thought it very nice. Still, he said, Ariel could pull a girdle round the earth in 40 minutes. The Savage, wrote Bernard in his report to Mustafa Mond, shows surprisingly little astonishment at or awe of civilized inventions. This is partly due, no doubt, to the fact that he has heard them talked about by the woman Linda. His Mustafa Mond frowned. Does the fool think I am too squeamish to see the word written out at full length? Partly on his interest being focused on what he calls the soul, which he persists in regarding as an entity independent of the physical environment, whereas I tried to point out to him strange sentence. Anyway, let's see. I'm gonna need to roll me a new cigarette here. This PDF is kind of full with spelling mistakes also. It says here, the controller. Controller. The controller skipped the next sentences and was just about to turn the page in search of something more interestingly concrete, when his eye was caught by a series of quite extraordinary phrases. Though I must admit, he read, that I agree with the Savage in finding civilized infantility too easy, or, as he puts it, not expensive enough, and I would like to take this opportunity of drawing your Lordship's attention to Mustafa Mond's anger gave place almost at once to mirth. The idea of this creature solemnly lecturing him about the social order was really too grotesque. The man must have gone mad. I ought to give him a lesson, he said to himself, then threw back his head and laughed aloud. For the moment, at any rate, the lesson would not be given. It was a small factory of lighting sets for helicopters, a branch of the Electrical Equipment Corporation. They were met on the roof itself, for that circular letter of recommendation for the controller was magical in its effects, by the chief technician and the human element manager. They walked downstairs into the factory. Each process, explained the human element manager, is carried out, so far as possible, by a single Bokanovsky group. And in effect, 83 almost noseless black brachycephalic deltas were cold pressing. The 56 four-spindle chucking and turning machines were being manipulated by 56 aquiline and ginger gammas. 107 heat-conditioned epsilon Senegales were working in the foundry. 33 delta females, long-headed, sandy, with narrow pelvises, and all with 20 millimeters of 1 meter 69 centimeters tall, were cutting screws. In the assembling room, the dynamos were being put together by 2 sets of Gamma Plus dwarfs. The 2 low work tables faced one another. Between them crawled the conveyor with its load of separate parts. 47 blonde heads were confronted by 47 brown ones. 47 snubs by 47 hooks. 47 receding by 47 pragnathus, no idea, chins. The completed mechanisms were inspected by 18 identical curly auburn girls in gamma green, packed in crates by 34 short-legged, left-handed male delta minuses, and loaded into the waiting trucks and lorries by 63 blue-eyed, flaxen and freckled epsilon semi-morons. O brave new world! By some malice of his memory the savage found himself repeating Miranda's words. O brave new world that has such people in it. And I assure you, the human element manager concluded, as they left the factory, we hardly ever have any trouble with our workers. We always find, but the savage had successfully broken away from his companions and was violently retching behind a clump of laurels, as though the solid earth had been a helicopter in an air pocket. The savage, wrote Bernard, refuses to take Soma, and seems much distressed because of the woman Linda. His remains permanently on holiday. It is worthy of note that in spite of his senility and the extreme repulsiveness of her appearance, the savage frequently goes to see her and appears to be much attached to her. An interesting example of the way in which early conditioning can be made to modify and even run counter to natural impulses. In this case, the impulse to recoil from an unpleasant object. At Eton, they alighted on the roof of upper school. On the opposite side of schoolyard, the 52 stories of Lupton's Tower gleamed white in the sunshine. College on their left and on their right, the school community singery reared their venerable piles of ferro concrete and vita glass. In the center of the quadrangle stood the quaint old chrome steel statue of our Ford. Hold on, guys. Dr. Gaffney, the provost, and Miss Keith, the headmistress, received them as they stepped out of the plane. "Do you have many twins here?" the savage asked rather apprehensively as they set out on their tour of inspection. "Oh, no," the provost answered. Eton is reserved exclusively for upper caste boys and girls. 1 egg, 1 adult. It makes education more difficult, of course, but as they'll be called upon to take responsibilities and deal with unexpected emergencies, it can't be helped, he sighed. Bernard, meanwhile, had taken a strong fancy to Miss Kitty. If you're free any Monday, Wednesday or Friday evening, he was saying, jerking his thumb towards the savage. He's curious, you know, Bernard added. Quaint. Miss Kitty smiled, and her smile was really charming, he thought. Said thank you, would be delighted to come to one of his parties. The provost opened the door. 5 minutes in that Alpha Double Plus classroom left John a trifle bewildered. What is elementary relativity? He whispered to Bernard. Bernard tried to explain, then thought better of it and suggested that he should go to some other classroom. From behind the door in the corridor leading to the beta minus geography room, a ringing soprano voice called, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then, with a weary impatience, as you were. Malthusian drill, explained the headmistress. Most of our girls are free martins, of course. I'm a free martin myself. She smiled at Bernard. But we have about 800 unsterilized ones who need constant drilling. In the beta minus geography room, John learned that a savage reservation is a place which, owing to unfavorable climatic or geological conditions, or poverty of natural resources, has not been worth the expense of civilizing. A click. The room was darkened, and suddenly, on the screen above the master's head, there were the penitentes of Acoma prostrating themselves before Our Lady, and wailing as John had heard them wail, confessing their sins before Jesus on the cross, before the eagle image of Pukon. The young Etonians fairly shouted with laughter. Still wailing, the penitentes rose to their feet, stripped off their upper garments, and, with knotted whips, began to beat themselves, blow after blow. Redoubled, the laughter drowned even the amplified record of their groans. "But why do they laugh?" asked the savage, in pained bewilderment. "Why?" The provost turned towards him a still broadly grinning face. "Why? Because it's so extraordinary funny." In the cinematographic twilight, Bernard risked a gesture which, in the past, even total darkness would hardly have emboldened him to make. Strong in his new importance, he put his arm around the headmistress' waist. It yielded willowily. He was just about to snatch a kiss or two and perhaps a gentle pinch, when the shutters clicked open again. "Perhaps we had better go on," said Miss Kitty, and moved towards the door. "And this," said the provost a moment later, "is the hypnopathic control room." Hundreds of synthetic music boxes, one for each dormitory, stood ranged in shelves round 3 sides of the room. Pigeonholed on the 4th were the paper soundtrack rolls on which the various hypnopathic lessons were printed. You slip the roll in here, explained Bernard, interrupting Dr. Gaffney. Press down this switch. No, that one, corrected the provost, annoyed. That one then. The roll unwinds. The selenium cells transform the light impulses into sound waves. And there you are, Dr. Gaffney concluded. Do they read Shakespeare? Asked the savage as they walked on their way to the biochemical laboratories past the school library. Certainly not, said the headmistress, blushing. Our library, said Dr. Gaffney, contains only books of reference. If our young people need distraction, they can get it at the Feelies. We don't encourage them to indulge in any solitary amusements. 5 busloads of boys and girls, singing or in a silent embracement, rolled past them over the vitrified highway. Just returned, explained Dr. Gaffney, while Bernard, whispering, made an appointment with the headmistress for that very evening. From the Slough crematorium. Death conditioning begins at 18 months. Every Todd spends 2 mornings a week in a hospital for the dying. All the best toys are kept there, and they get chocolate cream on death days. They learn to take dying as a matter of course. Like any other psychological process, put in the headmistress professionally. 8 o'clock at the Savoy. It was all arranged. On their way back to London, they stopped at the Television Corporation's factory at Brentford. Do you mind waiting here a moment while I go and telephone? Asked Bernard. The savage waited and watched. The main day shift was just going off duty. Crowds of lower caste workers were queued up in front of the monorail station 7 or 800 Gamma. Delta and Epsilon men and women with not more than a dozen faces and statures between them. To each of them, with his or her ticket, the booking clerk pushed over a little cardboard pill box. The long caterpillar of men and women moved slowly forward. What's in those? Remembering the merchant of Venice. Those caskets, the savage inquired when Bernard had rejoined him. The day's Soma ration, Bernard answered rather indistinctly, for he was masticating a piece of Benito's Hoover chewing gum. They get it after their work's over. 4 half-gram tablets, 6 on Saturdays. He took John's arm affectionately, and they walked back towards the helicopter. Lenina came singing into the changing room. You seem very pleased with yourself, said Fanny. I am pleased, she answered. Zip. Bernard rang up half an hour ago. Zip. She stepped out of her shorts. He had an unexpected engagement, and asked me if I'd take the savage to the Feelies this evening. I must fly. She hurried away towards the bathroom. She's a lucky girl, Fanny said to herself as she watched Lenina go. There was no envy in the comment. Good-natured Fanny was merely stating a fact. Or is that supposed to say feet? Because, again, spelling errors. Lenina was lucky in having shared with Bernard a generous portion of the savage's immense celebrity, lucky in reflecting from her insignificant person the moment's supreme fashionable glory. Had not the secretary of the Young Women's Fortean Association asked her to give a lecture about her experiences? Had she not been invited to the annual dinner of the Aphroditium Club? Had she not already appeared at the Feuilleton News, visible, audible, and textually appeared to countless millions all over the planet? Hardly less flattering had been the attentions paid her by conspicuous individuals. The resident world controller's second secretary had asked her to dinner and breakfast. She had spent one weekend with the fourth Chief Justice and another with the arch-community songster of Canterbury. The president of the Internal and External Secretions Corporation was perpetually on the phone, and she had been to the Vale with the deputy governor of the Bank of Europe. It was wonderful, of course, and yet, in a way, she had confessed to Fanny, I feel as though I were getting something on false presences? Isn't that supposed to say pretenses? Jesus Christ, it's getting worse by the page here. I don't know, false presences? Because, of course, the first thing they all want to know is what it's like to make love to a savage. And I have to say, I don't know. She shook her head. Most of the men don't believe me, of course, but it's true. I wish it weren't, she added sadly and sighed. He's terribly good-looking, don't you think so? But doesn't he like you? Asked Fanny. Sometimes I think he does, and sometimes I think he doesn't. He always does his best to avoid me, goes out of the room when I come in, won't touch me, won't even look at me. But sometimes if I turn round suddenly, I catch him staring. And then, well, you know how men look when they like you. Yes, Fanny knew. Alright guys, that's 58 almost time to go. Check out ucy.tv. After me is the Dork Table at reallibertymedia.com if you want to check that out. Otherwise, if you stay tuned to UCY, you will hear Darren Weeks, if I'm not mistaken. So thanks a lot. Trianons, Captain Dan, Hopper, Joe, Juana, Matty Clues, surely you jest. I'll see you guys next week. Take care, everybody. Thanks for listening.
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of scientific
Truth on the Tracks you can catch every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.TV.